In nature, we have four major classes of biomolecules, and so far we discussed two of these four major classes. So we focused on proteins and nucleic acids. Now we're going to move on and discuss the third class of biomolecules we call carbohydrates, or simply sugars. Now, in nature, the organisms use sugars for a variety of different ways, and in this lecture we're going to briefly discuss four different roles that sugars actually play. Now, there are many different types of sugar molecules, but the major sugar molecule that we use inside our body is glucose. Now, where does glucose and generally where do sugar molecules actually come from? Well, sugar molecules are produced by plants. And plants basically capture that energy that is stored in light that comes from the sun, and it transforms that energy into the chemical bonds within the sugar molecule. So what happens is, in the sun we have all these different nuclear reactions which take place and they release energy. And that energy is then stored in electromagnetic waves which propagate through space. And some of this electromagnetic radiation eventually makes its way to the earth and to the plants on earth. And so what these plants do is they take the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that's the carbon source, and then they take the water found in the soil and they use the energy stored in light. They combine these two reactants to produce these products, so the sugar molecule as well as oxygen that we then breathe and use on the electron transport chain in the process of aerobic cellular respiration. So essentially, when we ingest these carbohydrates, which are produced by plants, for instance, when we ingest bread products or pasta products and so forth, we essentially ingest carbohydrates which are derived and produced by plants. And so once we ingest these carbohydrates, our body breaks down these carbohydrates into their individual monomer sugars. And if this monomer sugar is not a glucose molecule, we typically transform that into a glucose molecule because it's the glucose that we use in the process of glycolysis and aerobic cellular respiration to basically produce the high energy ATP molecules that we use inside our body. And if we already have too many of these ATP molecules, if we have enough, the glucose can be stored in the form of glycogen for later use. So ultimately what happens is that energy that is produced in the nuclear reactions is basically stored in these chemical bonds within these sugar molecules. And when we ingest these sugar molecules, we essentially take that same energy that came from the sun and store it in the ATP molecules and use those ATP molecules to carry out all the different types of processes that take place inside our cells. So we see that the first role that sugars play is basically energy storage and fuel source. So we use these sugars to basically carry out different types of reactions by using these ATP molecules that ultimately came from the glycolysis process, the breakdown of glucose. Now, the second role that sugars play is actually being present in nucleic acids such as RNA and DNA molecule. In fact, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, itself contains a ribose sugar. So we have these RNA and DNA molecules, which are nucleic acids, and what that means is they basically play the role of storing genetic information and passing genetic information down from one individual to the offspring. Now, these RNA and DNA molecules basically contain sugar components. In the case of RNA, we have the ribose sugar. In the case of DNA, we have the deoxyribose sugar. And deoxy simply means on the second carbon, we don't have a hydroxyl group. So if we take a look at the following molecule, so if this base is, let's say, adenine, then this molecule would be that ATP molecule that we spoke of earlier. So we have the triphosphate group, we have that nitrogenous base, and these two groups are essentially connected to one another as a result of this sugar. So this is our ribose sugar that bridges these two molecules. And every single RNA molecule basically contains this group here, this unit. Now, the next function of sugars, the next role that sugars actually play in organisms, and this includes inside our own bodies, is using sugars to basically modify lipids and proteins, and we'll discuss this in much more detail in the next several lectures. So basically, we can diversify the capabilities and the functionality of proteins and lipids by basically attaching sugar components onto these macromolecules. So by combining sugars and proteins and sugars and lipids and so forth, we can basically increase the capabilities of these molecules. For instance, we already spoke about an important glycoprotein when we discussed the coagulation cascade. So we discussed the tissue factor. So we said that the tissue factor is basically a glycoprotein. So this is shown in green, and this is, let's say, the cell membrane of some endothelial cell found in the blood vessel. So what this tissue factor does is it's actually a glycoprotein that basically interacts with other molecules, namely factor 7, to form a dimer complex. And this glycoprotein, this tissue factor, is actually used to initiate the blood clotting cascade, the formation of the blood clot. More specifically, it initiates the extrinsic pathway of that coagulation cascade. And we have many different types of examples of ways in which we can actually modify proteins as well as lipids, and thereby diversify their function, thereby increase their capabilities and functionality. Now, the final thing I'd like to mention about sugar molecules is that in plants as well as in bacterial cells, sugars actually make up the components, are components of cell walls. And cell walls are very important because they serve a very important function. So they basically protect the cell, they also give the cell structure, they act in communication and also in transport. And we'll discuss this in much more detail when we'll focus on plants and the process of photosynthesis.